Welcome to Life Empowers with Melissa Oden. Where there is life, there is hope. Where there is life, there's a place for love to grow, and love emboldens and strengthens. Where there is life, there's an opportunity to grow and be empowered. I'm living testament to that, and you are too. And if you don't yet feel like your life is testament to this, don't despair and don't stop listening to this podcast. This is exactly why I'm doing it. Thanks for joining me this week as we delve into so many life-affirming topics. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2021 and welcome to the second season of Life Empowers. I am thrilled to be bringing you new guests, new concepts, new content through this next year, and it starts today, this podcast. And in this podcast, well, I'm going to warn you, my guest does a good job of letting you know there is some explicit content. But the reason why it's explicit is because, unfortunately, this is information that is getting passed along to our kids in our culture, even in some schools. So this week, my guest is Monica Cline from It Takes a Family. Realize, like I said, there is some explicit content here. Be prepared for that, right? Don't have little ears around, but do settle in. I don't want the idea of explicit content to turn you away. Well, everyone, I am with my friend Monica Cline today from It Takes a Family. And if you don't know Monica yet, this is your great opportunity. Monica, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me on, Melissa.
You know, when I think about it, I recognized your name. I recognized your face. I knew a little bit about your story, but it wasn't until this last year, right, being Pro-Love affiliates, that I got to know you even more and have come to just this even deeper appreciation of you, and not just on a professional level, but a personal level. So just thank you for being you. If nobody else has told you that this week, thank you.
Aw, thank you.
I mean, I don't think we hear that.
Well, thank you. Well, yeah, probably not. I don't think we do. Not that I ever feel like I need to ask for that, but it is always a good thing to let someone know that you appreciate them. And I'm not saying that because of myself and just what you shared with me, but I know that especially if you're doing this kind of work, if you're standing for life, if you're standing for family, and especially in this culture today, which I have to also say, this has been going on for much longer than we can imagine, but it just feels like it's, happening now. But to be able to share with one another how much we appreciate each other and our faith and our beliefs in protecting family and preborn children, we need that. We need to be supported in that. And so thank you. And as you were speaking, I was realizing, I was like, I so respect the work that you're doing. It's incredibly unique, a perspective that most people have never experienced or thought of. And you help us dive deeper with your stories, the testimonies, and those that are affiliated with your organization. And Melissa, I don't think I've ever told you this, but I actually came to Christ in the year 2000, and it was at a very large church, and the women's ministry invited you to speak. And so I actually saw you speak in the year 2000 in Texas at a church called Shoreline Church. And I had never heard a pro-life speaker before. And I was just really, and honestly, in sharing my testimony today, it's interesting. I was still working in comprehensive sex education when I heard you speak. And your story is amazing. And I have to say that I was just really struck with, I was just silent because I had no idea what was happening and what was happening in the abortion industry. And so your talk came at a point in my life where I was really deeply questioning the work that I was doing in comprehensive sex education. So as I say that, I want to remind your listeners that What you're going to hear today, I will speak with the utmost respect and honor. But at the same time, I need to let you know that it probably will get a little graphic because of the things that I know about with comprehensive sex education. So this is really not a podcast where you want little children's ears around, or even if you have some teens, if you don't feel like they're ready to hear this kind of thing. I would say this is definitely a podcast that moms and dads need to listen to on their own before they decide whether they should share this with their kids.
Yeah, and thank you for that background, because I didn't know that in terms of how you've gotten to this point that you are. And thank you for your information to let parents know where we're headed in this, because this is difficult, right? It's a difficult conversation for parents to have. It's a difficult conversation for you to have. And even though this podcast is all about how we empower people and life empowers people, you have seen firsthand the other side, so to speak.
I certainly have. And I haven't just seen the other side, Melissa. I lived what the other side was teaching. I mean, I was part of the other side. And I'll just use that as an opening into how that all happened. I did grow up in a very traditional Mexican-American family. My parents really modeled the need and the importance for family, the unity between a husband and a wife, and the protection over their children, and how they guided us. My parents they just really modeled a commitment to each other and to their children. So everything that we did, there wasn't anything that my father did that didn't include my mother and us, my brother and I, and the same with my mother. I mean, we were just a unit. Wherever they went, we went. And that was my upbringing, but I was not raised in the church or with a faith. And when I say that, is my parents really modeled, good values within the family and a relationship, but we didn't talk about it. I didn't receive a whole lot of warnings, and I didn't receive a whole lot of guidance. And I don't blame my parents for that. They did all the right things, to be honest. But in hindsight, I realized that when I left for college, I didn't have a basis that I could compare the world to. I didn't have a way to defend what my parents had taught us or modeled for us. And I think that that's really important as parents are listening to this podcast, that yes, you model your values to your children, but you also have to speak them. And because that really arms them and helps them to be able to respond to the world and what the culture is telling them that they should believe in. Our children need to not only be able to compare that to what their parents are modeling, but to be able to defend it as well mentally, through logic. And so, I was at the University of Texas at Austin. It was during the HIV epidemic. And by the time I graduated, I was asked to volunteer at pick an organization. I had already worked with different types of groups of people. I'd been a house parent at a children's shelter. I'd done several things. But the one thing I hadn't done was to volunteer or work with the LGBT community. And I had a relative who identified as a homosexual man, and he actually died of AIDS. And so in the 80s, before there was any treatment. And so when I saw this opportunity to volunteer for this gay organization, which had funding to provide HIV prevention education in the community, I jumped at that opportunity. I thought it would be an opportunity for me to learn more about my uncle's life and his culture, which at the time I didn't, I just wanted to know about his culture. And I also thought it would be good for me to learn how to help people avoid this virus that was, obviously harming so many people. And so I started volunteering for this organization. And one of the first things that they did was to teach me how to create condom packets. Most people don't know what those are. And so as a volunteer, I literally sat at a table with boxes of condoms and lubrication and instructions on how to put on a condom. And I would put them in these little tiny Ziplocs. And the outreach workers would use these to pass out to people on the street, in their homes, in neighborhoods, at schools, at after school centers for kids, and they would just distribute these condoms and talk to people about sex and how to prevent the spread of HIV and other STDs and pregnancy. And I was getting a little bored making these condom packets and asked for more experience. And so they sent me to a presentation that one of their outreach workers was conducting for teenagers in the Austin area. And I walked in, and it was a group of teens. It was an after school kind of a care place. And she was just really boldly speaking to these kids about sexual activities and how they could protect themselves. But it was very graphic. At the time, I was definitely living a very liberal lifestyle. I believed in sexual freedom and expressing your sexuality. I had never seen that being taught to teenagers, but this is what she was doing in addition to teaching them how to use condoms to prevent HIV, the transmission of HIV, other STDs, and pregnancy. And at the time, I didn't feel any conviction. I just thought, wow, this is a great thing. She's teaching these teenagers these things. And so my education started, and they saw that I was very interested in this. They quickly hired me. I became her coworker, and I became a street outreach educator. And street outreach educators literally walk the streets of high-risk neighborhoods and distribute condoms and talk about sex. We go to nightclubs, we go to schools. Within a month, they recommended that I go to Planned Parenthood, and the director of sex education at Planned Parenthood then trained me on how to share this message with young people, with children, middle school. And so it was just across the street from my office. It was on this clinic still exists. It's on 6th Street there in Austin, Texas. And the director of education gave me a one-on-one training on how to speak to children about sex and using condoms and how to navigate the healthcare system so they could get tested and how to do all of that without parental consent. And so she sat me down and gave me some horror stories about the young girls coming into the clinic as young as 10 years old, getting abortions, getting tested for STDs, being treated for STDs, getting on birth control, all without their parents knowing about it. And some of those stories, Melissa, were pretty, it really sounded more like abuse. And so I did tell her that, like, this is completely inappropriate. This is really, obviously, these little girls don't know what they're doing. Teach me how to teach these girls not to have sex. That is exactly what I said, even though it was very much about sexual freedom and that women were empowered for being, having sex without a commitment and all of these things. But when it came to children, I thought, wait, the little girls as young as 10, they're not supposed to be doing this. And I don't believe that they're choosing to do this. Obviously, it must be abuse. Well, she quickly changed my mind. She started to educate me and tell me absolutely not. It is very judging for you to think this way about these girls. This is their choice and this is their freedom, and they have the right to be sexual. And we just need to teach them how to do it safer. And so that's what she said. She goes, we're not going to teach them not to have sex. We're just going to teach them how to do it safer. And so then she said, when you walk into a classroom full of children, you need to look at them and think, that they've done anything and everything when it comes to sex. And if they haven't, they will. And it's your job as a sex educator to teach them how to reduce their risk for STDs and pregnancy by using condoms, lubrication, getting tested, and referring them to Planned Parenthood for abortions. So it's interesting that she says that, because at first she's saying we're going to prevent these things. But at the same time, she's admitting that they will get diseases, that they will become pregnant, and that it's a matter of treating them and aborting their children. And then the cycle starts all over again. She really, at the time, without knowing any other truth, I believed what she was saying. And many parents even believe this ideology that Planned Parenthood has, because they figure, well, they're going to have sex. It's true. Kids are going to have sex anyway. So now we have to do something to help prevent a lot of this. Instead of telling them not to have sex, we're going to teach them how to be safer about it. And so people submit to this ideology from Planned Parenthood. And so she began to teach me how to, I think, Melissa, what's really obvious to me today is that when we hear ideologies like sexual freedom, and when we see Planned Parenthood teaching what they teach, there's always contradictions to what they're saying. So on one hand, they're saying we're going to prevent disease, but on another hand, they're also admitting that they have to treat all those diseases. They say that they're trying to reduce abortion, but they're actually increasing the abortion rate. So there's always contradictions to everything that they say. So she's also this director was telling me, yeah, these kids are sexually active. This is what they do. There's no shame in it. This is what they want. But at the same time, one of the first lessons she taught me is when you walk into this room, the kids are not going to just start talking about sex because they are inhibited. So which is it? Are children not inhibited or are they inhibited? So she's admitting that they are inhibited, that they are modest, and that I need to break down that inhibition. And so the very first activity that she asked me to do with the children was to ask them to list all of their, all the slang terms of their body parts, sexual positions, just anything that they've heard that relates to sex, but in slang terms, meaning inappropriate ways of referring to themselves. And so basically you ask these kids to do this. Many of them don't participate right away, but when they realize that the authority in the room, the instructor, is encouraging them to do it and that they're not going to be judged for that, or there's not a punishment for that, they began to participate. And even the shy ones by the end of the activity are participating. And what they do is, they call out the names and the instructor writes them on the board, or the children come up to the board and write it themselves. And so at the end of the activity, what happens is that you have heard all kinds of crass terms about their body parts, about the act of sex, all forms of sex. It's very graphic, very inappropriate. Not only have they called it out, but then it is also written on a board. And as an educator, you can begin to understand what that does in changing the sexual attitudes of a young child who's naturally inhibited and modest. It begins to make them think that this is normal talk, and that it's normal to talk about these things with adults and in public places. And so what that does, Melissa, is it really starts to help the children dehumanize, take the sacredness out of their bodies, sacredness out of sex, and they begin to dehumanize each other. And so when the children are then being dehumanized towards one another through the act of sex, it then becomes a natural next step to dehumanize a preborn child through abortion. And so this is what Planned Parenthood and is doing. And it's not really just Planned Parenthood. It's SIECUS, it's Advocates for Youth. There are so many organizations who have come under and been trained by Planned Parenthood that are spreading this message all over the country. Not just the country, but Melissa, you know that they have an international outreach as well. And so this is really their approach, is by normalizing the act of sex, by removing it from intimacy, removing it from marriage, removing sex from this belief that it leads to having children. They're able to then restructure the way children think, and really it just allows them to get into this cycle of dehumanization. And then at the same time, it also, they're also teaching the children that they don't have to share this with their parents because they know their parents don't understand, that they might get angry, and that they don't need to talk to their parents about it because they have Planned Parenthood to support them. And so that's another step that happens with this kind of education, Melissa, is that they really want to remove the parent out of the picture. And so this work that I was doing, I did this for over 10 years. Not proud of that, but God has really used it so that I can now sound the alarm. But in those 10 years, I started as a street educator. And then I eventually ended my career as a Title X training manager for the states of Texas and New Mexico. And in all I was a consultant. I trained a lot on communication skills, client-centered counseling skills. And Planned Parenthood, even though they trained me at the beginning, I rose up the ranks that I eventually was training Planned Parenthood. And so they would ask me to come and train them and train their staff on how to talk to these young girls in the clinic. And in those years of spending time with Planned Parenthood, they always said this one line that stood out to me profoundly after I quit my job. And this is the line: parents are a barrier to service. As soon as a parent, this is their quote, as soon as a parent knows that their child is coming into Planned Parenthood clinic, the parent will protect that child and remove them from the clinic and not allow them to return. And they'll never see, and they basically said, we're not going to see that child again. So to prevent that, they ensured that those children felt that they could depend on Planned Parenthood for their services. They could use anonymous names. They could give the phone number of a friend, whatever was necessary so that the parents would not find out that the child was getting services there. And that's how they kept the children isolated from the parents. And they would say things like, we understand that your mom and dad would not understand that you're sexually active or that you're considering becoming sexually active. It's a natural thing that you're feeling. And we're going to be here to support you in any questions that you have or any services that you need. We're here for you. And so that child begins to then trust Planned Parenthood and see their parents as a barrier as well and something to be feared. And so this whole process of really restructuring and changing the way children think about themselves, their bodies, the act of sex, how they think about marriage, how they think about family is completely transformed by Planned Parenthood and this ideology that's pervasive. And at the same time, it demonizes parents. It says that parents are unreasonable. Parents are uneducated. Parents are not equipped to talk to their children about sex. Therefore, you must, quote unquote, depend on the sex ed experts that belong to these ideologies like Planned Parenthood. And it's a very dangerous thing. And we're seeing it today. Back then we didn't talk about the transgender issue. It was alive back then as well, which was in the 90s when I was working in that field. But today, comprehensive sex education not only does what I just described, but it also teaches children that gender is not binary. It is not male and female, but that they can choose their own gender. They can choose their own orientation. They can choose, all of these things. And they provide them with so many resources to continue to indoctrinate these kids into this belief that, that sexual activity can be recreational and that is absolutely normal. One of the things that they're also doing is, they demonize, not only do they demonize family, but they begin to demonize heterosexuality. So in Austin, Texas, and this is seen in a lot of different curriculum as well, when Austin ISD created their comprehensive sex education curriculum, one of the things that they did was to teach children about sexual orientation. And so they would list bisexual and pansexual and all kinds of things, homosexuality, bisexuality, but they never actually taught about heterosexuality. So instead of talking about heterosexuality, they called it heteronormative. And what they were really doing was saying that heterosexuality is not normal. Heteronormative or heteronormativity is a derogatory term for heterosexuality. And it's basically saying that the culture has lied to the community that heterosexuality is normal, and that we need to move away from thinking that heterosexuality is normal and start accepting that sexuality is actually fluid, and that you can be bisexual, you can be pansexual, you can be homosexual, you can be all those things, but really they don't want you to be heterosexual. And so the parents really push back on this curriculum. They actually remove that from the curriculum. I believe they're probably putting that back because they've been able to vote in that curriculum. And so I'm pretty sure Austin ISD will teach anything and everything at this point. But there really is a move to redefine humanity, redefine gender, redefine marriage, redefine family, and redefine sexuality. And that really happened with the sexual revolution, where sex was no longer part of family, no longer part of marriage, but that it was solely for a physical activity that brought pleasure, and that was all it was. And that the greatest strength and freedom that you could ever experience is to experience sexual freedom. So all of that said, basically, God really worked in my life in a lot of different ways. And I can, if you want, I can share some of that. But by the time I decided, I started realizing what was really happening. I started realizing And really, Melissa, one of the ways that I realized it was from the children themselves. I share this story about a 13-year-old girl. Planned Parenthood had asked me to fill in for them at an alternative school to teach sex education on this particular day. And it was a group of 13, 14-year-old girls and boys. And so basically, I went in to teach them about comprehensive sex education. I wrote down on the board what I usually write down, all the forms of sex, all the bodily fluids. I started explaining how STDs are transmitted and how pregnancy happens and what they can do by using condoms and things like that. And a little girl raised her hand. And and I'll clean up her language. It'll still sound graphic, but it's just because, you can't imagine a little 13-year-old girl saying this. But she asked a question and she was not being inappropriate. This was a real serious question from her. And she said, when I give boys, oral sex, I gag. Can you teach me how to do it better? And if your listeners right now, if you're listening and you're thinking, what, even as a sex educator, I was surprised by her question. And so I said, okay. And I kind of used my counseling skills at that point. I said, all right, well, I'm just going to repeat your question to you. And I want to make sure I understand what you're asking me and what you're saying. I said, so when you're involved in this activity, you have this reaction. Of course, I said it differently. You have this reaction. You don't like that reaction. And she's like, that's right. I don't like that reaction. But if you teach me how to do it better, maybe I will. And I said, well, have you ever considered just not doing the thing you don't like? And at that moment, all of the kids became silent and they looked at me. Now, this was an alternative school. So these were high-risk children who had been basically kicked out of all the other schools in their community. And this was their last chance for an education. So these kids were not well-behaved children. And they had seen a lot, I'm sure, in their community because I walked the streets of their community. But at that moment, they were all quiet and looked at me and they looked like kids again and they were innocent. And I said, guys, do you realize that you don't have to do anything when it comes to sex? And I pointed to the board behind me because I had listed the forms of sex. And I said, do you realize you don't have to have vaginal sex, oral sex, or anal sex? And if you don't, you'll never be in touch with these bodily fluids. And if you don't get in touch with other people's bodily fluids, then you won't be at risk of disease or pregnancy. And they just sat there quietly. And the same little girl who asked the question raised her hand again. And she said, ma'am, no one has ever told us that. So what had happened is that these kids didn't know that they didn't have to have sex. No one told them that they didn't have to be sexually active. And for the rest of the time in that classroom, these kids started to talk about abstinence. They didn't use the word abstinence. They just talked about different things that they could do with each other without touching one another, like playing basketball or going to the community center of the neighborhood and watching the free movies that they had and the free snacks that the community center provided to them. I mean, these were actually their suggestions to one another. Another little girl pulled away from the group because they literally huddled with each other talking about this. Another little girl pulled away and said, ma'am, I can't do what they're doing, right? And I said, her question was very revealing. She's like, right? She wanted me to disagree with her. And I said, well, why? Why do you think you can't do that? And she said, well, I'm already sexually active. Everyone expects me to be, so I can't say no. And I said, absolutely not. I said, you can say no. No one has the right to pressure you or tell you that you have to be sexually active. It doesn't matter if you have already been sexually active. If you choose today to not be sexually active until you get married, or maybe if you just decide you never want to have sex, of course, going really far. But I told her that is a reality. If you choose not to have sex, you don't have to. No one has the right to tell you that. She smiled brightly, went back to the group, and they continued to talk about ways that they could support each other in not having sex. To me, that just showed me that these children were craving the leadership of anyone who would tell them, you don't have to do this, or to just simply give them that option. And they received that option that day. And so I have so many stories like that of young people that I came to realize that this isn't what they really wanted, but no one was telling them that they had the option to avoid sex. And so more and more, I began to see how this education, comprehensive sex education, was slowly killing these communities. And I began to question everything. I also began to realize how abortion was always the only option.
What a powerful conversation with Monica. I know we kind of left you hanging there, right? Monica was going through the process of sharing with you the realizations she was coming to in her work. But I want to stop there for this week. Tune in for the next podcast where Monica and I continue our conversation and you learn more about what happens from there after Monica realizes the impact of the work that she's been doing, how all of it ultimately is connected back to abortion. Find strength in knowing how Monica has been transformed, knowing that you too can experience that same transformation, and that you too can make a difference by facing the reality of what is happening in our world. Be equipped, be empowered. See you next time. Thanks for joining me this week on Life Empowers. I hope you found our time together to be life-affirming, hope-building, encouraging, informative. And remember, the next time someone states that abortion is empowering, you know better. Life empowers. See you again next week.